Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you very much for staying in tonight on this frosty night. And we're going to be going on a journey backwards in time, right to the very start of it all, because I think we're at a critical moment, sadly, for the department store. We have lost, it's estimated, 83% of British department stores in the last 6 years. I mean, that really is quite something, isn't it? And obviously the pandemic played its part. They're still falling like flies. And I began researching this book just before the pandemic hit and thought, I think this is a critical moment in history where buildings where we once gathered, where we once kind of shared so many of life's moments, whether it was shopping for a wedding list, or first pair of school shoes, new fountain pen, retirement present. They're more than just shops, aren't they? They are, social hubs. And when we lose a department store, it is like losing, like a library or a museum. It's just much more than losing a store, particularly if it's in your own neighborhood. Now, I just want you to take a moment to think of your first department store memory. You will be a child probably, and it will probably be a very sensory memory. Maybe a door handle or the smell in the tea room. Just have a think for a moment, and I'd love to hear about those memories afterwards. But your memories might look something a little bit like this. Because for so many of us, it all started with that trip to see Father Christmas. It certainly did with me. I was taken to Harrods, where my mother once worked. And this is a friend of mine. She's sitting on the left, Caroline Morris. She went on to become a milliner to the rich and famous. And it all started for her in Shinners of Sutton. That's where her aesthetic sensibilities developed. So Christmas obviously is a big memory for us with department stores. Those shop windows, the decorations, the sense of great excitement, the countdown that begins, we think, earlier and earlier. Actually, it was Mr. Selfridge who invented that, only X more shopping days left till Christmas. He came up with that idea. So that's been going on some time. The first Christmas grotto was J.R. Roberts of Stratford, 1888. 17,000 children visited. There'd never been a Christmas grotto before, and very cleverly, their accompanying parent or adult had to pay 1 penny, and that all went to charity. I used to get taken up to Selfridges to see the windows, always the most theatrical, the most splendid, probably remains so today. So I hope the memories are now bubbling up from the past. But I'm sure for many of you, particularly perhaps if you grew up in London or the Greater London, an early memory might have looked a little bit like this. And you would have maybe got off that bus or out of the tube, High Holborn, and you would have been tugging your parents' hand as you walked briskly down the street towards Gamages. So excited, and maybe you'd been kind of holding in your hand on the train something a little bit like this that you'd been poring over all year. I'm seeing a few nods in the audience. You've been poring over, wondering what you were going to get that year. Perhaps it was just going to be one purchase a year. And if you couldn't afford to buy, well then, Gamages had more train track laid out, I think, than any store in Britain. It was a huge pull to young and old alike, as we can see. And people remain nostalgic to this day. The trains in Gamages are very much a kind of formative memory for so many of you. So where did it all begin? I'm going to take you now back in time to perhaps a quintessential department store in the West End. I wonder if any of you remember which store had this remarkable staircase. This is Dickens and Jones in its later Edwardian incarnation, the staircase, but here it is, pretty much at the start. It was opened by two drapers, as so many of them were. In 1835, they just opened up a little drapery store, Thomas Dickens and William Smith. Jones arrived a bit later, and so many of these stories are about a personality, usually a man. Those are the ones that we get to hear of in history, at least, who steps forward and really puts their stamp on it, has massive drive and energy. And so often these men came from the outside. And in this case, it was John Jones, a Welsh farmer's son. He joined in 1872. There we go, that's the time span of this store. And here he is, receiving his baronetcy some years later in 1910, when John Jones, who'd climbed up the ladder from buyer to manager to director to chairman to partner, now became a Sir, and he swiftly changed his name to Sir John Pritchard Jones, at which point Harrods took a controlling interest in the store. The shoppers never really knew who owned the store, as long as the name over the front remained the same and the offer was largely the same. They kept coming, and Dickens and Jones was renowned for its women's fashion and for its fabulous window displays. It was on a prime island site. That's what every store wanted. It had acres of space and windows stretching down one road, down another road. Window display became, in this early Edwardian era, an art, late Victorian era, really. So this quote is from an American trade magazine, and we learnt it, of course, from the Americans and their great stores. Arouse in the observer the cupidity and longing to possess the goods. Now, cupidity is one of the 7 deadly sins, isn't it? And suddenly it's a good thing. We want women, and it was particularly women that they wanted to part with their money, to kind of lust over these goods on show in the windows that kept changing. It was the department store that invented, in a sense, fashion, seasonal fashion. And we're still living with that today, aren't we? I mean, how many times a year did the windows change their display and the next must-have is suddenly on show? And you can see for the elegant Edwardian lady, this was very much the place to shop. Queen Victoria had shopped there, Princess Alexandra, then Queen Alexandra shopped there. You know, they had their royal warrant. And going through into the 40s and the 50s, it remained a really elegant mecca for women. It employed 1,000 staff by the 1950s. 1,000 people worked for Dickens and Jones. It opened up branches. There was one in Epsom, there was one in Richmond, and Harrods were then eaten up by House of Fraser in 1959, and this is very much part of the quintessential department store story of little fish being eaten by bigger fish until they're owned by such massive fish that they don't really care too much about the future of whichever store. Who remembers the Lady in the Rose? This was the iconic logo or symbol that was designed by René Grau in 1954. René Grau, who was responsible for Dior's new look. And it tried to keep pace with the times, but I think the apogee for fashion was probably this era. In the 70s, it decided to branch out into menswear. It opened up a special man's shop, lovely 70s font there. But its customers were increasingly elderly, its offer looked a bit fusty, a bit stuffy. You know, there were boutiques opening up everywhere. But it wasn't that finished it off. It was a sudden, shocking rent rise in 2006 from 250,000 to 4.5 million per annum that forced it to close. That is an absurd rent rise. This was the Edwardian rebuild by Sir Henry Tanner, well, not Edwardian actually, post 1922, this was the rebuild. And I wonder if that is a familiar looking facade to you. I walked past it only yesterday. I looked up, here it is today. That was once Dickinson Jones. And once it's gone, it's very hard to even remember that this immense house, as they were known, traded from here for so long. I started researching my book just before lockdown, and I had visions of sitting in archives and sifting through old photographs and old account ledgers, you know, just the kind of thing that historians love to do. I love sitting in the archives. Very quickly, that was completely impossible. So I had to go online, but I did find some quite interesting books that helped me. Now, every historian needs a guide, and my guide, one of my guides, was Olivia. I did read the original of this book in the British Library. I hadn't realized that it had been reissued as the essential guide for the 1906 woman, Edwardian woman about town. It's an anonymous little guide. It's a prejudiced guide to the London shops, written by somebody who knows, and she really tells it to you straight. You know, where you absolutely mustn't spend half a crown on a cup of tea, where to get the best suede gloves, you know, where you can leave your dog while you go shopping. Army and Navy was very good for that. If you're waiting for a bus, which windows are the best to gaze at? And she's quite waspish too when the stores get it a bit wrong. And she was my guide for things like, you know, where to get the best silk corset and suspenders. That's from Debenham and Freebody. The best shoes. These are from Harrods. The best tailor-made. I think this is from Liberty. Tailor-made walking dress by Redmayne. And the best millinery. A bit of murderous millinery there. And that was from Derry and Tom's. She really liked the hats at Derry and Tom's. And so off I set, imagining that I too was an Edwardian shopping woman, wondering about this massive growth of department stores in this era and what was driving it. Well, women were driving it, but also far better transport links. So see how easy it is here to go all the way by underground to Derry and Tom's. You could get quite comfortable rapid electric trains all over the capital by this era. And women were able to go to a department store unchaperoned as well. It was somewhere safe to spend the day. I love this cross-section of Piccadilly Tube. And this opened in 1928, this kind of wonderful ticket hall. And the people looked like little termites scurrying around below ground. This was absolute state of the art, but it brought you straight up there, Piccadilly Circus. There's Swan and Edgar. And it was very easy to get to the shops, and there were so many of them. Out we pop, we're on Oxford Street. Another of my guides was a rather racy little novel written in 1909, same era as Olivia, by H.G. Wells, Anne Veronica. And this is very much a new woman novel. The rise of the new woman, the emancipated, increasingly independent, quite tricky woman about town who is no longer going to be kowtowing so much to the patriarchy. She might even have a bit of money. She might have a bit of a little job. These stores were great drivers of emancipation. Not only could you meet there unchaperoned, and they might have reading rooms, restrooms for women, tea rooms, restaurants, but they were also great employers of women once the owners realized that you could pay women half as much as men. And yeah, women in this era were very much on the move. They were highly visible. And this was all quite new. They were in the streets. And the men felt rather unsettled by this on many levels. But one was that women were having access to consumption, to stores, to temptations in a way that they had never had before. Could you trust your wife in a store? Now, this crops up again and again in little court cases when the wife would go shopping and she'd say, put it on the account. And her husband would know nothing about this until the bill arrived. These were new things to navigate. Of course, this is the same era of the rise of the suffragettes, women marching highly visibly in the street, pretty much a fashion parade with the suffragettes too, wearing the latest looks. And all the department stores rush to court them, to put the colours of green, purple and white in the windows, to offer suffragette hats. Mr. Selfridge flew the suffragette flag from the top of Selfridge's whenever Mrs. Pankhurst was released from prison and hunger strike. So these were the customers that the money was chasing. And as you can see, they had money. This was an era of an absolute boom in wealth and the expansion of the middle classes. And these stores were popping up all down Oxford Street and further afield. Those that had started as very small drapers in the mid-19th century and grown and grown and grown, by now, frankly, had to have a very smart Edwardian rebuild. This building is still very much there on Oxford Street today, Waring and Gillows. I wonder if any of you remember the furniture at Waring's. I mean, fabulously, beautifully designed modern furniture was on offer there. And you can also peer inside these stores thanks to some extraordinary photographs that still exist. This comes from a very rare, unusual album of 12 photographs that Historic England somehow got their hands on. It was given to them. And this is from Robinson and Cleaver, the Irish linen warehouse, so called, that opened its new store on Regent Street in 1904. And it was judged to be the most extravagant, over-the-top, sumptuous store that London had yet to offer. Look at the wonderful birdcage lift, the marble columns, the vaulted ceiling, the lighting, the display. And I went to look at the newspapers at the time to see what they made of it. And the Daily News reporter said, metropolitan shops have long been the objects of unfavourable criticism by our Parisian neighbours. Now, Londoners will have one shop, at least, which will compare favourably with any to be seen in the French capital. So yeah, this really was the kind of creme de la creme when it opened. I mean, who has heard of Robinson and Cleaver today? People went to department stores to keep pace with innovation. It was where everything that was new was displayed. Things were being constantly invented in this era and refined. And this is the lighting department of Barker's, just around the same era. And electricity was in so many homes now. If you couldn't afford it or you didn't have it, you could just go and look and marvel at what could be on offer if you had the money, what the rich were buying. As I said, department stores wooed, seduced, and undid women. Shoplifting was a bit of a thing. It was a bit of a problem. Middle-class women were thought to be helpless when faced with all these temptations laid out before them. And actually using that as a defense in court, I couldn't help myself, was entirely admissible. But this gang, Alice Diamond, there she is top left, and the 40 Elephants, who hailed from Elephant and Castle, these were professional thieves. They ran a kind of crack squad throughout central London for a good 3 decades. And they had various different techniques that they were feared by shop store detectives around London, always passing on intelligence to each other. Their techniques involved perhaps a fainting fit and the staff would rush to help, or taking something up to the window to see it in a better light. And they all wore these voluminous bloomers with very tightly elasticated knees. And underneath those big coats, they were then able to kind of shove all this booty down their bloomers. I mean, extraordinary things. Crocodile skin handbags, even fur coats, stoles, jewelry, clocks, and must have been good elastic. And out they went. Sometimes they would hit a store en masse. There might have been a dozen of them through the doors. And before the detectives or anyone could grasp what was happening, like locusts, they might have stripped a whole department, rushed out to their getaway vehicle, horse-drawn and then motorised. So yeah, women were to be feared for many things, but shoplifting, both upper class and the likes of Alice, definitely began to boom as these stores grew and the temptations in them grew. Now, one big driver of consumption and women's fashions and courting women as customers was Selfridges. When it opened in 1909, this store, built after an American model by Harry Gordon Selfridge, bringing over all those American sales methods, the psychology of selling, the great picture windows, very theatrical it was. All the other stores had to play catch up. They had to rush to emulate, because this store just kind of wiped the floor of the West End. No one had seen anything like Selfridges. Its opening was compared to the opening of a museum or gallery. I mean, look at that classical architecture. This is a picture from the 30s. You can just see how sort of high class, luxurious, spoiling the environment was. Look at that deep pile carpet, those mannequins with dresses that you can go up and touch. You can try things on even if you can't afford it. Mr. Selfridge rather cleverly opened the first ladies' lavatory in a department store. Isn't that incredible that women had to wait till 1909 to be able to go to the loo in comfort? And with that one stroke, he really did women a great favour. He pushed the cause of emancipation, but of course he ensured that they really did spend all day in his store, which was exactly what he wanted. He wanted it to be a bit like the gentleman's club, but for women. Why not spend the day at Selfridges, went the slogan, a pleasure, a pastime, a recreation. And there is something just a bit saucy about the young lady and the florid-faced young buck having having a very respectable tea in the tea room, totally unchaperoned. I think the suggestion is that exciting things might happen to you if you spend the day in Selfridges, but you will always be entirely respectable. On the roof, he had fashion shows. There was a roof garden. There was a lovely restaurant up there too. There was pitch and putt. I mean, it was like going on holiday, frankly. Here he is, Harry Gordon Selfridge. And although he was not entirely respectful towards the women in his life, you know, we know he was a bit of an older philanderer, he did do a lot for women with the store. He said, "I came along just at the time when women wanted to step out on their own." He banned the phrase shop girl. He thought it was demeaning, and he was right. He introduced the new phrase shop assistant. So let's pause for a moment and have a think about the world of the shop assistant, the young woman and a young man who have to appear looking highly respectable, women always in a black silk dress. Often they lived in, not in Selfridge's case, but they didn't earn that much. They had to be very patient, work incredibly long hours. I mean, William Whiteley's assistants worked from 7 in the morning till 11 at night, 6 days a week. They got fined for breaking the numerous rules that he had, for being late, having a box of matches in your pocket, seeing a visitor, for chatting. You know, the fines went straight into his pocket. Most shop assistants lived in. It was hard work, either behind the scenes or in front of the scenes. These pictures I'm showing you now are from Morgan Square, a department store in Leicester, and they were sent to me by someone who found an old album in a junk shop. So keep your eyes peeled, because these things have great rarity value. Yeah, I spoke about living in. If you look, the windows all along the top, this is Bradley and Sons, the so-called Arctic Fur store, Chepstow Place, Notting Hill. Those were dormitories up there where segregated men and women slept crammed like sardines. And every time a store went up in flames, as they worryingly quite often did, this was a terrible fire hazard. And well, you know, their lives were in danger. Barker's had some very unlucky news headlines when several of his assistants burnt to death in one of the fires that engulfed Barker's. This is Peter Robinson's, the canteen for its seamstresses in 1908. And what amuses me is this picture was taken as an advertisement as to how, look, see how we're looking after our staff, see what marvelous facilities we're giving them. This was a piece of PR. But to me, it looks a bit like the workhouse. Peter Robinson was notoriously old-fashioned and fusty and backwards in the way it treated its staff. It was the last store to keep that living in system going. And there was increasing clamour from shop assistants and also the public as they began to be more aware of their plight, that things had to change, that living like this and being treated like this, actually, it wasn't good. And things came to a head with the Army and Navy, that august cooperative. 3,000 walked out over pay on over 5 days in December in 1919. Here they are, victorious. The public was stunned to discover what their working conditions were like. The fact that the the army, the founding army members, their shares were being repaid at 350%. And yet the staff were being paid really derisory wages and putting up with pretty appalling working conditions as well. So they got what they wanted, better pay, shorter hours, and they received full pay for the strike period. But it set up a spate of other strikes, perhaps most famously in John Lewis. Here are his girls walking out on picket. 400 workers walked out, and all they wanted was to be allowed to join the union. But good old John Lewis, the old curmudgeon, and he was an absolute curmudgeon, he wasn't having any of it. He treated his staff pretty terribly. They went on strike for 6 weeks. And he wasn't going to let them get their way, and he just sacked them all in the end. And I was quite pleased to discover that they were snapped up by Pontings in Kensington. Pontings was very pleased to get such high-class shop girls. John Lewis. The strike didn't dent the store's great popularity. I mean, look at that. Look at those shoppers. We think Oxford Street's bad today. This is an absolute throng. He had to die, and he died in 1928 before things changed at John Lewis, before his more enlightened son, John Spedden Lewis, took over and turned it into the shared company that we know and recognise today, where profits are shared out to workers. I'm pleased to say that staff morale and staff perks did improve gradually as we move forward through time. And some stores, particularly those in Greater London, in the suburbs, treated their staff pretty well. They were very paternalistic towards them. This is Cheeseman's Jubilee outing. Who remembers Cheeseman's? Lewisham. They used to pull punters in at Christmas with circuses. They had once an untamable lioness called Vixen. So they're all going off in their shower banks, looking very happy indeed. And meanwhile, over at Pratt's of Streatham, lovely Pratt's, that then became part of the John Lewis partnership, they had a garden behind the store where staff got to relax during their lunch hour, where there were fruit trees that grew fruit that was then used in kind of apple and apricot crumbles in the staff canteen. So this was very much a sort of family vibe at a store like Pratt's. And treating your staff well, it repaid itself. Harrods became very good at doing this. Bourne and Hollingsworth had a staff swimming pool. They all started to scramble to get rather better PR for the way they treated their staff. Let's just circle back to the Army and Navy, because things did get better there. And it popped up in a certain very famous novel. Mrs. Dalloway. I wonder if anyone can remember the scene in Mrs. Dalloway, where Miss Kilman has tea. She goes shopping with Elizabeth Dalloway. Elizabeth is Mrs. Dalloway's lovely young daughter. And Miss Kilman is a rather sort of pinched and lonely single lady of the era, for whom, life was difficult, circumscribed. And her great treat was being taken to the Army and Navy to buy some very boring things, including a petticoat. And then she sits down and has tea. And I'll just read you a line or two, because I think the tea room of the department store was a really important cultural hub of its time. Miss Kilman opened her mouth, slightly projected her chin, and swallowed down the last inches of the chocolate éclair, then wiped her fingers and washed the tea round in her cup. She was about to split asunder, she felt. And then Elizabeth makes her excuses and says she has to go because she's sort of desperate to leave. And off she goes. And Miss Kilman sat at the marble table among the éclairs, stricken once, twice, thrice by the shocks of suffering. She had gone. She got up, blundered off among the little tables, rocking slightly from side to side, and somebody came after her with her petticoat, and she lost her way and was hemmed in by trunks, specially prepared for taking tea to India. This gives you a nice sense of the Army and Navy, all the many different things that's crammed in there that you can find to buy, and those little tables of the tea room, where life's little dramas are played out. We're going to move forward in time now to the 30s. Our grandparents, or perhaps parents' era in some of our cases. And fashion it's aping Hollywood. Everyone's trying to look like a film star. And the stores are really ramping up the volume on their fashion displays, fashion coming in from Paris, Hollywood starlets being enticed to come and do a kind of special opening of something. And just let's walk up Regent Street and see what the 30s has brought to London. So Swears and Wells, this used to be the Lilliputian warehouse where very posh children got their clothes. And then it turned more to furs. This is a very beautiful deco frontage. Closed in 1970 because fur was falling from fashion back then. Further on up, the Gallery Lafayette. Now, many women have a soft spot for this store. It seems to have really seduced quite a few. This came from Paris. They decided to open up in London, take on the Brits at their own game, bring a bit of Italian dazzle, a bit of Parisian dazzle to the capital. They also brought these fabulous wax models, these mannequins, and they were made by Pierre Iman, who was a Dutch-born Frenchman, and he really pioneered this extraordinarily lifelike, naturalistic style of mannequin. They are all ages. They're all shapes and sizes. They look like human beings, kind of flawed, hopeful, vain. And it's said that when the Galerie Lafayette first opened, and there were these fantastic theatrical tableaux in the windows of these mannequins all dressed up, that people gathered because they thought, well, is it haunted? What's going on in here? They couldn't believe that these weren't real people. There's a book I would really like to recommend, and it is set in a department store. Lightly disguised, it's actually Selfridges. It's called Every Man, and it follows the fortunes of a young graduate. She's called Hilary Fane, and she decides to see if she can live for a year on her wits in London, to try her hand in a department store. So I wondered why in the novel she applied to Selfridges, because this is the era of fabulous 30s rebuilds, or builds. This is brand new, of course. Simpson Piccadilly, the first department store for men, Joseph Emberton. We've got Kensington High Street, where Derry and Tom's got its wonderful deco rebuild, and then Barker's just that little bit later, in the late 30s into the 40s. This is Derry and Tom's marking the Jubilee. Is it the Jubilee or the coronation? This store, I used to walk past every day on my way to my job at the Daily Mail, and I never looked up at the architecture. So I went back when I was doing my research, and I was frankly gaping at the beauty of it, the details. I do urge you to do likewise. It's now the Marks and Spencer on the High Street. You'll see things like this on the outside by the wonderful metalwork craftsman Walter Gilbert. I mean, can you imagine decorating any kind of store with this sort of detail today? Nope. The advertising was sumptuous for Derry and Tom's. Going inside, I mean, just look at the lift. One of its lifts was sold at auction to some fantastically rich Californian recently. But no, we wanted to get rid of them. It had the Lanson tube system right up to the end, right up to 72 when it closed and then became briefly Big Beaver. This system for shuttling money around a department store that many people remember from their childhoods. And then up high, it had a roof garden. How I wish I could have spent my lunch hours up there. I discovered the young woman, here she is, Esme Bradburn, who planted all these plants. She never went down in the history of the store. Just the male garden designer got the credit. This is the young woman who did all the planting. She became a founding member of the Soil Association eventually. It was said that a vicar used to spend his lunch hours up here writing his sermons. I can't think of a better place. So yeah, other 30s stores, this era of fabulous architecture and redesign, Shinner's of Sutton. And this was the place where if you were smart in Sutton, you wanted to have your function, your anniversary party, your daughter's wedding. You hired the restaurant Shinner's of Sutton. And somebody who remembers Shinner's of Sutton is, Michael Frayn is the little boy on the right. And this cropped up in his autobiography. He says, we're going shopping in Sutton's great department store, Shinner's, to buy what? I never notice. Only the immensely grown-up clatter of the lift gate and the sophisticated swoosh of the little cable cars that are shot along overhead wires to carry the cash from the counter to the cashier's office and bring the change back. And Holdren's of Peckham was rebuilt in 1935, still there today. It's Khan's Bargains, right opposite the station. Bodgers of Ilford, again, 1935. John Barnes of Finchley, 1935, now a Waitrose. Randall's of Uxbridge, 1937. But no, in this novel, oh, hang on, not forgetting, although it's very much still with us, just Peter Jones, William Crabtree design, the first curved sheet glass facade to be built in Britain. And I think it's lost its zing today, but I can recommend looking down the stairwell at the back. If you don't take the lifts, it's still got beautiful architectural features. Yes, our young woman in the novel, Hilary, she chooses Everyman or Selfridges, which has been going since 1909. And here it is all decked out for the coronation of George VI. Selfridges really went to town with the way it dressed its storefront. So I look forward to seeing what it does for our imminent coronation of King Charles. It has its roof garden. What's not to like? It has lift girls, look at them, very smart. These were replaced after the Second World War with war veterans. It was thought to be a kind of kindly act to give these poor war wounded the job. But plenty of male customers were rather upset that the nice young lift girls had gone from Selfridges. Hilary brings to life the behind the scenes world of Selfridges brilliantly. She says, "I'd no idea what devils women could be to other women in an entirely passive way." So this is a delightful read for the backstabbing, the passive aggressive kind of bitching, frankly. They're trying to keep her in her place, but she is clever, she's full of ideas, and she rises, and that really upsets the apple cart behind the scenes at every man's. The story of department stores, as my research, it was kind of one man after another. It's always the men who seem to get written about. This is Sir John Barker, a rugged, restless, ruthless individual. This is Sir John Barker's right-hand man who took over when he died. Skinner, make your staff love you and fear you in the same breath. And then the man behind Derry and Tom's and its fabulous roof garden employed by Sidney Skinner. This is Trevor Bowen, once a confectioner from Monmouth. He said, "The best advertisement is a woman's tongue." Now, I don't really like that expression, but what he's saying is, you know, once you've seduced the women, once you've got the women, then you're laughing that, you know, they are your best advertisement. But I wanted to find some real women behind these stores. It was really hard to discover them, but I put back, the last man. Who could forget Sir William Whiteley, who had inexhaustible energy and business pluck, quite an ego, clearly. In fact, such an ego that his fate was sealed when his illegitimate son shot him dead in his own store, right next to the umbrella stand, or the umbrella counter. You can find out all you need to know about William Whiteley and the likes of Harry Gordon Selfridge. You know, they've had dramas written about them. Who are the invisible women, the real women, who are doing the work behind the scenes? Here's one. This is Ida Fowle. She joined Harrods as the first woman to be employed in 1885 as a bought ledger clerk. Mr. Harrods didn't want to employ women. He thought that they wouldn't be as loyal as men. But when he discovered that they cost half as much, he suddenly changed his mind. And she spent a long time working at Harrods. She gave it the rest of her life. She grew her team to 400 women. She became head of bought ledger, looking after all the money, the wages. She worked 8 a.m. to 8 p.m, 10 p.m. on Saturdays with 2 hours off, one evening a week. So that was Ida, remembered very affectionately when she died. This is her picture in the Herodian in-house newspaper. And then this is Hilda Harvey from Selfridges. She joined age 23 as a shorthand typist when the store opened in 1909. And what helped her climb up was the First World War, when so many men left to join the war effort. Hilda was able to step forward, and she ended up secretary of the Staff Record Bureau. And pretty much every woman who worked for Selfridges had to be interviewed by Hilda Harvey. This picture was given to me by her niece. Now, who is this rather slinky looking woman? This is Evelyn Whiteside, who worked for Harrods. She worked for Simpsons. She helped set up their women's wear department. And she ended up being the first female director of Fortnum and Mason. She was known as one of the cleverest buyers in the trade. I read an interview with her done in 1960, and she said that her secret weapon in the boardroom was good grooming, an essential part of a businesswoman's equipment. And this is Irene Stevens from the John Lewis Partnership. Irene ended up running Pratt's. She started work in department stores in middle age, and she was at Peter Jones in the furniture department, and then she was doing regulation school dress, manager merchandise. It was a way that you could progress as a woman. There was a career path. And in her 50s, director of buying, fashion accessories, chief registrar, director level, member of the Central Council. She retired in 1983, much loved, and you can probably see why. She's got such a lovely face. And yeah, retired 1983. I found this young woman in the Harrods in-house magazine. I'm just keeping one eye on my watch here. Do tell me when we need to wind it up and go to the questions, because I've just got a little bit more. Okay, make a sign at me. This is Maggie Giles, who, aged 17, arrived at D.H. Evans on Oxford Street. She came all the way from Newquay in Cornwall, and she was staying at Diggs in Belvedere, right out in Erith in Kent, and it took her 2 hours to get to work. She started doing these little illustrations for the staff magazine while she was working for sales promotion at D.H. Evans. Now, D.H. Evans got its fabulous rebuild in the 30s, just in time for the coronation. It became the biggest department store on Oxford Street because building restrictions had relaxed. It was 100-foot high. Fabulous, soaring escalator hall. People would go to London just to ride the escalators in D.H. Evans. It had a whole floor given over to beauty culture. I mean, it really was a sumptuous sounding store. And something had intervened between the 30s and Maggie in the 50s. The war, of course. Now, London's department stores did get it in the neck. During one night of the Blitz, Oxford Street was turned into a river of fire, bombs its length, and many of the big stores were, I mean, virtually destroyed. But the incredible thing is, for so many of them, that's Peter Robinson, it was business as usual the next day. You know, they boarded up the windows, they swept up the glass, and they got on with it. And D.H. Evans was one such. All the girls reported to work the next morning, even as fires raged at the far end of Oxford Street. This is John Lewis. So I think department stores were part of our British spirit, are symbolic of our morale. And, you know, Hitler did his best, but they rose up from the flames and they kept on trading. Here's D.H. Evans. So young Maggie Giles arrives and spends 3 very exciting years working for this store that is very glamorous. It's employing Arpad Elfer to do its advertising. See all these posters on the underground. And she is doing, as I said, illustrations in the in-house mag. And we'll just show you a couple of these. My New Year's resolutions: I will always be ready with the correct change. I will never contradict Madam, showing how difficult it is to work in a big store. I will always be willing to exchange goods without any fuss. I will endeavour to be helpful and pleasant under all circumstances. Of course, it's never been worn. And she also keeps a little illustrated diary, which I got to see when I visited her. What a terrible day. I'm all shot to hell. There's a fashion show. She's run off her feet. And these just rather lovely illustrations show how exciting it must have been to be young, working in a big store like that in London, having come from, she comes from Cornwall, but these stores were great melting pots of young people all seeking their fortunes. Into the 60s, Joanna Lumley, she was a house model at Debenham and Freebody, just when skirts were rising right up the legs and false eyelashes were de rigueur. She went off to work at this very fusty store. By the 60s, these stores were falling out of fashion. Girls like Joanna didn't want to shop where their mothers shopped. Here it is, building still there. They had to walk around, this is the marble staircase, with these kind of ridiculously old-fashioned kind of tweed jackets and coats or fur coats trailing them after them with a little sign on them saying how much it was. Here she is. So yeah, the demise of the department store, I think the 60s began to spell the end of that certain style of shopping, decorum and quality fashion. Boutiques were where it was at. And the other reason for the demise of the department store, back to Gamages, was that the land that they stood on was suddenly worth so much more than anything that the store could bring in. And Gamages was one such. It was trading very well, it was very popular. And then suddenly in the 70s, it was acquired, knocked down, and a glass office block was built on the spot. And that really upset, 1972 it was, the writer Barbara Pym, who worked just up the road. And she used to spend her lunch hours wandering mindlessly around Gamages, as she put it. And department stores crop up a lot in her novels. And so we're left with the store that gave rise to that great sitcom, Are You Being Served? Once so chic, when it opened, no one had seen interiors like this before. It was the coolest thing going in London at the time. It had 3 light aircraft on one floor during its opening week. Incredible stunts to pull in shoppers, was finally reduced to the material which Jeremy Lloyd drew on, the writer Jeremy Lloyd, who is behind Are You Being Served, who worked there for a stint, and it was such an extraordinary microcosm that he couldn't help but parody it in the end. I'm going to stop there. And I'm sure that sparked lots of memories for you. And let's hand over to see what questions people